I never thought a corner store in Southwest Atlanta would be where my story began. But life has a way of writing its own lyrics, doesn't it? September 14th, 2010. I remember the exact date because it was the day everything changed. The day I found my voice in the most unexpected way. I was 14 then, spending my afternoons at Miss Evelyn's corner store, my grandmother's pride and joy on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. The rusty bell above the door had been chiming for 30 years, announcing every character in our community's ongoing story. While other kids hung out at the mall, I sat behind that scratched wooden counter, scribbling lyrics in my beaten-up notebook, watching life unfold through the fingerprinted glass windows. That Tuesday afternoon was unusually hot, even for Atlanta. The ancient ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, barely moving the thick air. I was working on what I thought was my masterpiece, a 16-bar verse about Mama's late-night shifts at the hospital when I heard the first shouts. Two of our regulars, Mr. James from the auto shop and Pastor Mike from the church down the street, were going at it over some fender bender. The tension had been building for days, and now it was about to explode right there between the chips aisle and the refrigerator case. My heart was pounding against my ribs as their voices got louder. Grandma Evelyn was at the bank and I was alone in the store. Mr. James's face was getting redder by the second, and Pastor Mike's hands were shaking as he pointed and yelled. Then something inside me just snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. Before I could think twice, I was standing on that wooden milk crate we used to reach the top shelves. The words flowed out of me like they'd been waiting their whole life for this moment. In this corner store where stories meet, where rubber meets road on a dead-end street, two kings standing tall with pride to keep, but the cost of anger ain't worth the receipt. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. James's mouth hung open mid-sentence. Pastor Mike's finger froze midpoint. And there I was, this skinny white girl on a milk crate, heart thundering in my chest, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But then Pastor Mike started nodding. Mr. James's shoulders relaxed, and somewhere in the back of the store, my grandmother, who'd returned without me noticing, was holding up her phone, recording every second. That video never went viral. It didn't need to. It did something more important. It showed me who I was meant to be. The next day, the regulars started calling me Little Poet, but I knew I was something else. I was a phoenix, about to rise from the ashes of ordinary life into something extraordinary. Looking back now, I realize that moment wasn't just about stopping a fight. It was about finding my purpose in the space between beats, in the rhythm of real life, in the power of words to bridge divides. That hot September afternoon in a corner store in Southwest Atlanta, I learned that sometimes the most powerful verses aren't written in notebooks. They're written in the moments when we're brave enough to stand up and speak our truth. What happened next? Well, that's when things really got interesting. Word travels fast in Atlanta, but nothing travels faster than word of someone standing up to Marcus Jenkins and his crew. October 12th, 2010, just another Tuesday at Benjamin Banneker High, until it wasn't. I was cutting through the courtyard to get to AP English when I heard them, three seniors cornering a freshman against the brick wall, his backpack already on the ground, papers scattered like fallen leaves. The kid's name was Darius. I knew him from my grandmother's store, always buying pencils one at a time, counting pennies carefully. Marcus had him by the collar, and something in me just clicked. Maybe it was the corner store incident still fresh in my mind, or maybe it was seeing Darius's eyes wide with the same fear I'd felt standing on that milk crate. Yo, Marcus. The words left my mouth before my brain could catch up. If you're so tough, why don't you try spitting bars instead of threats? The courtyard went dead silent. Marcus turned slowly, that signature smirk spreading across his face. Little white girl wants to battle? This ought to be good. I stepped into the circle that was already forming. Phones came out like stars appearing at dusk. Marcus thought he had an easy win, the big bad senior about to put the sophomore in her place. But he didn't know about my late nights studying Lauryn Hill, Queen Latifah, and MC Lyte. He didn't know about the verses I'd been writing since I was 12, or the battles I'd been having in my head every night before sleep. Ladies first, he sneered. I closed my eyes for just a second, channeling that corner store courage. Then, you think you're tough picking on the small? That ain't power, that's fear standing tall. See, real strength ain't about who you can break. It's about the stand that you choose to take. You got height, you got might, you got crew. But all I see is a kid scared of what he can't do. So step back, rethink, rewrite your story, because bullies don't make it into history. The crowd erupted. Even Marcus's boys couldn't hold back their reactions. But what I didn't notice then was Mr. Matthews standing in the doorway of the music room, nodding his head to my flow. I didn't know he used to be DJ Maestro, spinning at the Dungeon back in the day when Outkast was just getting started. Marcus tried to come back with some weak lines about my race, my gender, the usual stuff. But his heart wasn't in it anymore. The crowd could feel it. Power had shifted. By sixth period, the video was on every phone in school. By the end of the day, I had 300 new Instagram followers and about an equal number of dirty looks. Mr. Matthews caught me after last bell. "You got a gift," he said, sliding a flyer across his desk. The basement. Underground battles every Friday night. Real MCs. Real competition. He saw my hesitation and added, "Your bars are solid, but raw talent only gets you so far. Time to decide if you want to be good or if you want to be great." I folded that flyer and put it in my notebook right next to my latest verses. That night, I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, the words good or great echoing in my mind. I didn't know then that this was another crossroads, another moment when life was about to take a sharp turn. But looking back, I realized something. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in courtyards or clubs. They're fought in those quiet moments when we decide who we want to be. The basement was waiting, and I was about to step into a world that would either make me or break me. December 15th, 2010. The night I stopped being just the girl who could freestyle and became something more. Mama was supposed to be there, her first night off in 2 weeks. But at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the talent show, her phone lit up my pocket. "Emergency at Grady Memorial. Double shift. I'm so sorry, baby." I sat in the school auditorium's backstage area, clutching my notebook, surrounded by singers practicing scales and dancers stretching. The page in front of me held the words to "Streets Don't Sleep," verses I'd written watching Mama drag herself through the door at dawn, still wearing her scrubs, bone-tired but somehow still standing. Mr. Matthews found me there, staring at those words until they blurred. "Your mom?" he asked. I just nodded. He sat down next to me, quiet for a moment, then said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes the most powerful songs are born from empty chairs." When Miss Thompson called my name, the spotlight felt different than the circle of phones in the courtyard. Heavier, more real. I stepped up to the mic, and instead of my usual introduction, I spoke from somewhere deeper. This is for everyone who's ever watched their mama cry over bills at the kitchen table. For everyone who's ever pretended to be asleep when she checks on them after that second shift. This is Streets Don't Sleep. The beat dropped. Simple, raw, just like the life it described. My voice found its rhythm. 3 a.m., kitchen lights still burning, mama's counting pennies while the world keeps turning. Coffee cup rings on unpaid bills. Working double shifts, but we're standing still. Streets don't sleep and neither does she. Sacrifice and love's all I see, empty chair at my school events. But her absence here makes perfect sense, 'cause when life deals cards from the bottom deck, she plays her hand without any regret. I didn't see Principal Watkins wipe his eyes. Didn't notice Miss Rodriguez from Channel 11 News slip in the back door. All I saw was Mama's empty seat in the front row, and all I felt was the truth flowing through every word. When the last note faded, the silence was absolute. Then someone stood, then another. Then the whole auditorium was on their feet. Through my tears, I saw Mr. Matthews in the wings, nodding like he'd known all along. But it was the text that came at 11:47 p.m. that really mattered. Just watch the video Grandma Evelyn sent. "My baby girl, you make every double shift worth it. Love, Mama." The next morning, Channel 11 ran the story. Atlanta's next hip-hop hope? Teenage rapper brings truth to the mic. But they missed the real headline. This wasn't about being the next anything. This was about being the first me. A white girl from Southwest Atlanta who learned that sometimes our deepest pain becomes our greatest power. That night changed everything. But the basement was still waiting, and with it a whole world of battles I never saw coming. Success? That was just the beginning of my troubles. March 4th, 2011. The air had a charge that night, like Atlanta itself was holding its breath. I just turned 15 2 weeks ago, but the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. My cousin Kayla handed me her ID with a smirk, daring me to back out. "Ava, you've got the words. Now show the world." I stared at the ID, the picture just close enough to pass under dim lights, and nodded. The basement wasn't just a venue, it was a rite of passage. Stories of legends like Outkast, Killer Mike, and T.I. cutting their teeth there echoed through every block. This was Atlanta's heart beating underground, and I was about to step into its pulse. It was past 10 p.m. when we reached the faded brick facade of the club. A long line snaked around the building, buzzing with energy and expectation. Kayla whispered, "Stick close. Act like you belong." My heart hammered as we approached the door. The bouncer, a massive man with a face like stone, glanced at the ID, then at me. He grunted and waved us through. The air inside was thick with sweat, smoke, and history. The walls were plastered with posters of battles past, names I'd heard whispered on the streets and in Mr. Matthews' tales. The stage was barely a platform, illuminated by a single spotlight, but it might as well have been Madison Square Garden. And then it happened. The first battle of the night. 2 MCs squared off, trading bars like punches. The crowd roared, every line dissected and devoured in real time. One of them, a wiry guy called Spitfire, unleashed a verse so sharp it felt like the air itself was bleeding. His opponent, visibly shaken, fumbled his comeback. The crowd erupted in boos, and just like that, he was out. I couldn't breathe. This was raw. This was real. And I knew in that moment I had to be part of it. Kayla leaned in, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "They've got amateur night next week. You signing up?" I should have hesitated. I should have thought about what Mama would say, about what it would mean to step into this world. But the words left my mouth before my brain caught up. Yeah, I'm in. The rest of the night was a blur of voices, beats, and bravado. As we left, the cold night air hit me like a slap, but my mind was racing. The basement wasn't just a place, it was a proving ground. And I had just committed to stepping into its fire. March 11th, 2011. I'll never forget the smell of it. The sweat, the beer, the faint trace of smoke that clung to every corner of that underground room. The basement was alive, vibrating with an energy that wrapped around you and dared you to step out of line. I was standing in the back, palms slick with nerves. My name scrawled on the amateur sign-up sheet like a promise I couldn't break. When they called my name, the room shifted. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The weight of 100 skeptical eyes pressed down on me as I climbed onto that makeshift stage. My stomach churned, but my hands stayed steady. I was Ava Carter, a white girl stepping into a predominantly black space where authenticity wasn't optional, it was survival. Who let her in? A voice cut through the room like a knife, and the laughter followed. My opponent, King Z, leaned against the mic stand, his gold chain catching the light. He was tall, cocky, his grin wide and full of teeth. "This ain't open mic night at the coffee shop, little girl, you lost?" The crowd roared, feeding off his confidence, and I could feel their doubt thick in the air. But it wasn't anger that rose in me. It was clarity. I wasn't here to prove them wrong. I was here to prove myself right. King Z went first, his words sharp, calculated, designed to cut. "Look at you," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Little Miss Suburbia, thinking she can spit. Hip-hop ain't no Halloween costume, baby. You don't belong." The crowd ate it up, the noise deafening. But I stood still, hands gripping the mic, every bar I'd written burning in my chest, waiting to break free. And then it was my turn. I leaned into the mic, my voice steady, my words deliberate. "You're right, I don't belong. I never said I did. But see, truth ain't tied to the color of your skin. It's in the struggle, the fight, the pain we endure. It's in the stories we tell, the voices so pure. You want to mock my face, my race, my place. But culture's more than a box to erase. It's the roots, the respect, the lines we don't blur, and the love for the craft. I'm here for her." The room shifted. The noise softened into something heavier, deeper. They weren't just listening, they were hearing me. King Z's smirk faltered, just a little, and I pressed on. "You spit fire? Cool, let's see the burn." But a king's gotta earn the respect in return. So take your shot, Z, but aim with care, because the truth cuts deep when the crowd's aware. By the time I finished, the room was still. For a moment, I thought I'd failed. Then slowly, a single clap broke the silence, and then another and another. The hostility was fading, replaced by something warmer, respect. King Z nodded, his grin now more genuine than mocking. Not bad, he muttered, stepping back from the mic. It wasn't a concession, it was an acknowledgement. And then I saw him. Damon Reed, the man whose name was whispered like a myth in every corner of Atlanta's hip-hop scene, standing in the shadows near the back of the room. He was watching me, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I stepped off the stage, my heart still racing, and felt Kayla's hand squeeze my shoulder. You did it, she whispered. No, I thought. I'd only just begun. April 3rd, 2011. If someone had told me a month ago that Damon Reed, the Damon Reed, would want to mentor me, I would have laughed them right out of Miss Evelyn's corner store. But there I was, sitting in a booth at Manny's Diner on Auburn Avenue, across from a man whose name carried the weight of a legacy. You've got raw talent, Damon said, his voice low and deliberate, like every word was part of a verse. He leaned back, arms crossed, studying me with eyes that seemed to see right through to the words I hadn't written yet. But raw talent will only get you so far. If you want to make it, really make it, you need to understand what you're stepping into. He wasn't wrong. I'd spent the last month reliving my first battle at the basement, dissecting every bar, every reaction, wondering how I could have been better. But Damon wasn't offering compliments. He was offering a challenge. Do you even know where hip-hop came from? He asked, his tone sharp enough to sting. Do you know what you're representing when you stand up there? I didn't. Not really. I knew the beats and the rhymes, the stories they told. But the roots? The struggle that birthed it all? I'd barely scratched the surface. Meet me here tomorrow, he said, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table. 8 a.m. Don't be late. The next morning, I found myself in a tiny recording studio tucked behind a barbershop. Damon didn't waste time. He handed me a stack of vinyl records and a notebook. Start with these. Listen to the cadence, the wordplay. Write what you hear. And when you think you understand it, we'll talk. For weeks, we worked like that. Early mornings in the studio, long nights in the basement. Damon broke everything down. Flow, delivery, breath control. He dissected my verses, showing me where I stumbled, where I shined. Hip-hop ain't just words over a beat, he told me one night, the faint hum of a bass line filling the room. It's rhythm. It's resistance. It's rebellion. And if you don't respect that, you don't belong here. I was learning more than I ever thought possible, but there was something else too. Something darker. Damon's critiques weren't just sharp, they were cutting. If I missed a beat or fumbled a rhyme, his frustration burned through the room. At first, I thought it was passion, a drive to make me better. But over time, his words started to linger, to sting in ways they hadn't before. You're not here to play, he snapped one day when I stumbled over a line. If you're not all in, don't waste my time. I brushed it off, telling myself this was part of the process. Greatness required pressure, didn't it? But the cracks were starting to show. Damon's control wasn't just about the music, it was creeping into everything. Wear this, he'd say before a battle, handing me a jacket or a pair of shoes I didn't pick out. Say it like this, he'd insist, rewriting lines he thought weren't good enough. By the end of April, I was torn. Damon had pushed me further than I'd ever thought possible. My flow was sharper, my delivery stronger, and my understanding of hip-hop deeper than I'd ever imagined. But at what cost? Looking back now, I realize those early warning signs were the seeds of something bigger, something I wasn't ready to face. But at 15, all I knew was this. Damon Reed was opening doors I never knew existed. And for better or worse, I was walking through them. June 14th, 2011. I didn't know my life was about to change when Kayla shoved her phone in my face, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. Ava, she said, barely able to contain herself, your video hit 20,000 views. I blinked at the screen, the numbers not quite registering. 20,000? Just last week, I was hyped over 200. It was a clip from my last battle at the basement, where I'd gone head-to-head with a rapper twice my age and held my ground. Damon had called it my best performance yet. but even he hadn't seen this coming. The next few days were a blur of notifications and messages. My phone buzzed constantly, strangers tagging me, local blogs sharing the video, even a couple of verified accounts dropping fire emojis in the comments. People were talking about the white girl with the bars, and while the label stung a little, I couldn't deny the momentum. By June 20th, my name had reached the ears of 97.5 The Beat, Atlanta's go-to station for hip-hop. I was sitting at the breakfast table, halfway through a bowl of cereal, when the call came. "Is this Ava Carter?" The voice on the other end was smooth and confident. "This is DJ Rico from The Beat. We've been hearing about your battles at the basement. Think you can drop by the station for an interview?" I nearly choked on my milk. Yeah, definitely. The interview was set for June 23rd at 3 p.m. Damon insisted on prepping me, drilling questions and responses like it was a battle. "They're gonna test you," he warned. "Don't just be good, be unforgettable." The day of the interview, I walked into the studio with my heart pounding so loud I was sure the mic would pick it up. DJ Rico greeted me with a handshake and a grin. "You've been making waves, Ava. Let's see what you've got." The first few minutes were easy. Questions about my background, how I got started, what it felt like to perform at the basement. But then Rico leaned in, his tone shifting. "I hear you've got a message, not just a flow. Care to share a little of that with us?" I took a deep breath and nodded. Damon had always told me to have something ready, a freestyle that could hit hard and leave an impression. This was my moment. I leaned into the mic, my voice steady. Kids on the corner, dreams slipping away, told they're not enough every single day. But this mic? It's power, a place to stand, to rise above the struggle, to make a demand. You're more than your block, more than the grind. Your story's a verse, just waiting to shine. Don't let the world tell you who to be. Stand tall, speak loud, set yourself free. The studio fell silent for half a second before Rico broke into applause. "That," he said, shaking his head, "was fire. Ava Carter, y'all. Remember the name." The clip of that freestyle hit the station's social media within the hour. By the next morning, it had been shared over 100,000 times. Comments poured in from all over, teachers, parents, even a youth center in Detroit tagging their kids and saying, "This is for you." And then came the emails. Damon was the first to notice. "Atlantic Records wants a meeting," he said, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "And so does Def Jam." Record labels. Actual record labels. It was everything I dreamed of, but as the offers started rolling in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The world was listening. Now I had to figure out what I wanted to say. September 9th, 2011. They started calling me the Underground Queen before I even realized I'd earned it. It wasn't a title I claimed for myself. It was whispered by the crowd, written in blog posts and shouted from the back of packed battle rooms. By then, I had a rhythm. Every Friday night, I was at the basement, stepping onto that weathered stage, facing opponents who underestimated me before I even opened my mouth. But week after week, I let my words do the talking. I wasn't just holding my own anymore, I was winning. And not because I was loud or flashy, but because I listened, observed, and struck where it mattered most. I'll never forget September 16th. The air was heavy with anticipation. The room hotter than usual, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for me to face off against a local favorite named Vortex. He was a powerhouse, known for his aggressive style and relentless flow. I'd watched him dismantle competitors with ease, but I wasn't intimidated. I had a weapon he didn't see coming: Phoenix. Phoenix wasn't just an alter ego. She was a force, a version of myself that was sharper, bolder, and fearless. When I stepped into that persona, the doubts melted away, replaced by a fire that burned through every line I spit. Phoenix didn't just battle, she soared. When Vortex hit the stage, the crowd roared. His opening verse was everything I expected, hard-hitting, packed with punchlines meant to rattle me. But I stood there, calm, waiting. When he finished, I stepped forward, let the silence stretch for half a beat, and dropped my first line. "You call yourself Vortex, spinning wild and fast, but hurricanes fade, they don't ever last. Phoenix rises, eternal, unburned. Every loss is a lesson, every flame earned." The crowd erupted. Vortex smirked, trying to shake it off, but I could see the doubt creeping in. Line by line, I chipped away at his bravado, weaving wordplay with precision, layering my bars with meaning. By the time I hit my closing verse, the room was electric. You swing hard, but your punches don't land, 'cause a king without wisdom ain't fit to command. Phoenix don't fall, Phoenix don't break. Every trial's a spark, every battle's a stake. When the battle ended, there was no question. Vortex nodded, respect glinting in his eyes, and the crowd chanted my name. Not Ava, Phoenix. But not everyone was cheering. Damon's presence had grown heavier in my life, his mentorship evolving into something darker. After every battle, his critiques cut deeper. Phoenix is good, he'd say, but she could be better if you just listen. He started calling the shots, what I wore, who I battled, even the lines I delivered. At first, I thought he was pushing me for my own good. But by September, his control was undeniable. He wasn't mentoring me anymore. He was molding me into his vision of success. One night, after a particularly heated battle, he cornered me backstage. "You're great because of me," he said, his tone sharp. "Don't forget that." Those words stuck with me. I wanted to believe I was climbing this ladder on my own, that Phoenix was mine and mine alone. But Damon's grip was tightening, and I didn't know how to break free without losing everything I'd worked for. That fall, I learned two things. The crown of the underground queen was heavy, and not all battles happened on stage. Some were fought in the shadows, against the very people who claimed to have your back. January 10th, 2012. I remember the exact moment my phone buzzed with an email from Atlantic Records. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of cereal I'd forgotten about, when Kayla gasped from across the room. "Ava, they want you," she whispered, shoving her phone toward me, her excitement spilling over. The subject line read, "Collaboration opportunity, Atlantic Records." My heart raced. For months, whispers about record labels had followed me like shadows, names like Def Jam, Sony, and Universal thrown around in casual conversations. But seeing it there in writing was something else entirely. It wasn't just Atlantic. By January 15th, 3 more emails had rolled in, each one bigger than the last. Damon was thrilled, more energized than I'd ever seen him. "This is it," he said, pacing back and forth in the tiny studio where we'd spent countless hours. "This is the moment we've been working for." But we didn't feel right. These were my bars, my battles, my journey. And yet, Damon was already steering the ship, arranging meetings, dictating responses, acting like he was the one they'd emailed. By January 20th, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room downtown, facing a table of executives who looked more polished than human. They spoke in numbers and contracts, mentioning touring schedules, royalties, and image branding. Damon was at my side, nodding along like he belonged there, his voice louder than mine every time I tried to speak. When they slid the first contract across the table, my gut twisted. Something about the way Damon's hand lingered over the pages like he already owned the decision made me uneasy. "You don't need to read all of it," he said later, as we sat in his car outside the studio. "That's what I'm here for. To protect you." But protect me from what? On January 25th, Mama finally stepped in. It was late, and I'd just gotten home from another negotiation Damon had insisted I attend. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes tired but sharp, the way they always were when she had something serious to say. "Ava," she began, her tone measured, "I've been watching. Damon's been good for your career, but..." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's not good for you." I wanted to argue, to defend him. After all, Damon had helped me grow, hadn't he? But deep down, I couldn't ignore the weight in her voice, the truth I'd been trying to push aside. She continued, "You're 16 years old, and these decisions, contracts, tours, labels, they're huge. If you don't take control now, you'll lose more than you gain." Her words sat heavy in the air long after she went to bed. For the first time, I allowed myself to see Damon the way Mama saw him. Not as a mentor, but as a man who had become too comfortable holding the reins of my life. By the end of January, I'd turned down 2 offers. Damon was furious, calling me ungrateful, reckless, naive. "You're throwing it all away," he snapped during one of our worst arguments. But Mama's voice echoed in my mind, stronger than his anger. "Take control now." The industry had its eyes on me, but for the first time I realized I needed to have mine wide open too. This wasn't just about deals or fame. This was about finding my voice, Not just on stage, but in the world Damon wanted to pull me into. And if I wasn't careful, it was a world that could swallow me whole. March 3rd, 2012. I found the email by accident. I was in Damon's studio scrolling through his computer for a beat he'd promised to tweak when I clicked on the wrong folder. At least, that's what I thought. But as the list of messages opened before me, it became clear there were no accidents that day. The subject lines were unmistakable. Ava Carter opportunity. Not the right fit. Decline on her behalf. My stomach dropped as I clicked one, then another. Universal had reached out weeks ago about a collaboration. Sony had expressed interest in signing me directly. And Damon? Damon had responded to every single one without telling me. The words on the screen blurred as I realized the truth. He'd been turning them down, controlling my career in ways I hadn't even imagined. When he walked into the room, I was still sitting there, frozen, the emails open like evidence at a trial. He stopped short, his face darkening as he saw the screen. "What is this?" My voice was steady, but inside I was shaking. "You've been sabotaging me? Lying to me?" Damon's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he didn't have a quick answer. "You don't understand," he said finally, his tone sharp. "I'm protecting you. These people, they'll chew you up and spit you out. You're not ready." "Not ready?" I stood, anger bubbling up like I'd never felt before. "Who are you to decide that? This is my life, Damon, my career." His eyes narrowed and the room seemed to shrink around us. "Your career is nothing without me," he snapped. "You think you got here on your own? Everything you have is because of me." I should have walked away then. I should have grabbed my bag and left without another word. But I couldn't. I was too angry, too hurt. "You don't own me," I said, my voice rising. "You're not my savior, Damon. You're a liar." That was when he lost control. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm, his grip like iron. "You don't talk to me like that," he growled, his face inches from mine. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" I yanked my arm free, heart pounding. "Watch me." I don't remember grabbing my bag or running for the door, but the next thing I knew, I was outside. The cool March air hitting my face like a slap. Damon's voice followed me, sharp and venomous. "You'll regret this, Ava. I made you, and I can break you." I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, my chest heaving, my mind racing. His words echoed in my head, but they didn't drown out the one thing I knew for sure. I couldn't go back. That night, I called Mama, my voice trembling as I told her everything. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't lecture or scold. She just listened, her calm strength wrapping around me like a lifeline. "You're stronger than him, Ava," she said when I finished. "Don't let his threats stop you. This is your time, not his." March 4th, 2012. The headlines started the next day. Damon didn't waste time spreading his version of the story, painting me as ungrateful, difficult, and out of control. But for the first time, I didn't care. I wasn't running from him. I was running toward something better. This was my breaking point. And from here, there was no going back. April 5th, 2012. When I opened my eyes that morning, I knew it was the day I had to stop being silent. My hands were still trembling as I typed the words, but my heart was steady, strong. I wasn't just telling my story, I was reclaiming it. It started with a single post, raw and unfiltered, shared across every platform I had. For months, I've stayed quiet out of fear. Fear of losing my career, fear of retaliation, fear of not being believed. But silence has a way of suffocating you. And I refused to let it choke out my truth. Damon Reed controlled me. He sabotaged my opportunities, manipulated my career, and when I confronted him, he turned violent. I'm done protecting him. It's time the world knows what he's done. Not just to me, but to others like me. If you've experienced the same, speak up. Together, we're louder than his threats. I hit post before I could second-guess myself, and then I waited. The response was immediate. Messages poured in. First from fans offering their support, then from others who had crossed paths with Damon. Some were battle rappers, others were aspiring artists. Their stories mirrored mine, promises that turned into control, mentorship that became manipulation, and dreams he used as leverage. April 10th. The first major break came when The Beat, Atlanta's biggest hip-hop station, picked up my story. They invited me for an interview, giving me the platform to speak openly. Sitting in that studio, the mic in front of me felt heavier than ever before. This wasn't about spitting bars. This was about speaking truth. Damon Reed was more than a mentor, I said, my voice steady despite the weight of my words. He was a gatekeeper. He used his position to control, to exploit, and to silence. And for too long, we let him. I thought I might face backlash, but instead, something incredible happened. One by one, other artists began coming forward, sharing their own experiences. By April 15th, the movement had a name: #BreakTheChains. The hashtag trended nationwide, a rallying cry for anyone who'd ever felt trapped by someone more powerful. Local venues acted fast. Within days, Damon was banned from every major stage in Atlanta. The Basement, the place where I'd found my voice, issued a public statement. We stand with Ava Carter and the artists she represents. Damon Reed is no longer welcome at the Basement or any affiliated events. By April 20th, the tide had fully turned. What started as my personal fight had become a collective roar. The hip-hop community, known for its resilience and resistance, rallied in a way I'd never seen before. Artists who'd once been rivals stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding accountability and promising to protect the next generation. I'd spent months feeling small, trapped under Damon's shadow. But now I was standing taller than ever, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been silenced. This wasn't just my reclamation, it was ours. And we weren't done yet. June 3rd, 2012. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my bedroom, staring at the microphone I'd borrowed from a friend. The walls of my tiny space felt like they were closing in, but the notebook in my lap was open wide, the words I'd scrawled across the page burning to be set free. Phoenix Rising, I whispered to myself, the title carrying more weight than any bar I'd ever written. This wasn't just a song. It was a declaration, a refusal to stay silent, and a testament to survival. I wasn't just telling my story, I was telling ours. Recording it was raw and unpolished. No fancy studio, no professional equipment, just me, the mic, and a beat I'd built from the sounds that filled my mind in the quietest moments. My hands shook as I hit record, but when the first words came out, they felt like armor. They tried to bury us, silence our names, said our voices were tools, just part of their game. But Phoenix don't burn. She rises. She fights. From ashes to glory, reclaiming the night. Verse by verse, I poured it all out. The manipulation, the sabotage, the way power in the industry had been used as a weapon. It wasn't just about Damon anymore. It was about every artist who'd been crushed under the weight of someone else's control. Every dream deferred by those who saw us as stepping stones. When the final chorus faded, I sat there in the silence, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time in months, I felt free. By June 10th, the song was live on every platform I could reach. But it wasn't enough to stop there. This wasn't just my fight. So I reached out to others, those who had come forward in the wake of my story, the voices that had joined mine in the #BreakTheChains movement. Be part of the video, I told them. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. On June 15th, we gathered in an abandoned warehouse in downtown Atlanta. The energy was electric, every survivor standing tall, their faces unmasked and unafraid. The cameras rolled as we stood together, letting the music carry us. Each scene told a story. Fists raised, chains breaking, voices lifted in unison. By June 20th, the video for Phoenix Rising hit the internet. It didn't creep. It exploded. Within hours, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Text messages, notifications, calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The video had been shared thousands of times, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. By midnight, it was trending worldwide. The comments poured in. This is the anthem we needed. Thank you for speaking up. Phoenix isn't just you, it's all of us. Celebrities retweeted it. Activists reached out. Radio stations played it on repeat. But what mattered most were the messages from people I'd never met, from cities I'd never been to, telling me their stories, sharing their truths, finding their voices. I'd recorded Phoenix Rising in the corner of my bedroom with nothing but a mic and a dream. But now it was bigger than me. It was a movement, a spark that had ignited a fire I knew would never burn out. June 30th, 2012. I stood on stage at a packed venue in Atlanta, performing Phoenix Rising live for the first time. The crowd sang every word, their voices louder than my own. And as I looked out over that sea of faces, I realized something. This wasn't a comeback. This was a revolution. August 1st, 2012. The first time I walked into a label's conference room and sat at the head of the table, it hit me. I was no longer asking for a seat. I was demanding one. Atlantic was the first to call, then Def Jam, then RCA. Every day, a new email, a new pitch, a new promise. They weren't just interested, they were desperate. Phoenix Rising had shattered expectations, turning heads in ways no one saw coming. Suddenly, I wasn't just Ava Carter, the girl from the basement. I was a commodity, a prize they all wanted to claim. The meetings were surreal. Executives in tailored suits talked at me, not to me, throwing around numbers so big they barely felt real. 7-figure advances, tour budgets, marketing campaigns. It was dizzying. But every time they got to the fine print, their vision for my career came into focus. Polished, packaged, and palatable. We'll bring in top producers to refine your sound. One exec said on August 4th, sliding a contract across the table. You've got raw talent, but we need to make you mainstream. Mainstream. The word stuck in my throat like a thorn. They didn't want Ava Carter. They wanted someone they could mold, someone who fit their idea of marketable. By August 10th, the offers were stacking up, each one bigger than the last. Damon was still in the shadows. His presence felt even when he wasn't there. I could almost hear his voice in my head. You're nothing without me. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but it also fueled me. I wasn't going to let him define my next move, or let these labels do the same. Mama was my sounding board through it all. Late at night, we'd sit at the kitchen table, contracts spread out in front of us, her glasses perched on her nose as she read the fine print I didn't understand. They want control, she said one night, her voice steady but firm. But control isn't something you can afford to give away. Her words stayed with me. By August 15th, I knew exactly what I wanted. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about my voice, my story, my terms. When the next exec tried to tell me what Phoenix Rising could have been with better production, I pushed back. You don't get it, I said, my tone cutting through the room like a blade. That song isn't just music, it's my truth. If you can't respect that, there's no deal. It was August 20th when I met with Crescent Records, a smaller, independent label with a reputation for championing artists, not products. The vibe was different the moment I walked in. No suits, no rehearsed pitches, just people who loved music and wanted to make it without compromise. Their CEO, a woman named Marisol Vega, sat across from me, her eyes sharp but warm. We don't want to change you, Ava, she said. We want to amplify you, but only if that's what you want. By August 28th, I'd signed the deal. Crescent Records wasn't offering the biggest advance or the flashiest promises, but they were offering something no one else could. Freedom. Creative control. Respect for my vision. The news hit the industry like a shockwave. Blogs called it a bold move, fans praised me for staying true to my roots, and rival labels scrambled to spin the loss. But not everyone was celebrating. Damon's name started surfacing again, whispers of his bitterness spreading through the grapevine. I'd hear rumors about him trash-talking me at industry events about the deals he claimed I'd stolen from him, but I didn't care. Damon could plot all he wanted. I wasn't looking back. August ended with me in the studio, a fresh notebook in hand, ready to begin the next chapter. For the first time, I felt like the pen was truly mine. Damon might be watching, but this story was mine to write. October 3rd, 2012. The first day of recording felt like stepping into a dream I'd spent years building from scraps of hope and determination. The studio was alive with energy. Engineers adjusting levels, producers layering beats, and collaborators brainstorming ideas. But for me, it was more than that. It was the space where I could finally tell my story, unfiltered and unapologetic. The album was called Unbreakable. The title wasn't just a statement, it was a promise. To myself and everyone who had ever doubted me. Every track had a purpose, every verse a message. This wasn't going to be another polished product for the industry machine. It was going to be raw, personal, and fearless. The first song we worked on was Roots, a collaboration with a spoken word poet named Amir Khalid. His voice carried the weight of generations, and together, we explored the complexity of cultural identity, what it meant to honor the roots of hip-hop, while standing as a bridge between worlds. The beat was heavy, layered with samples of ancestral chants and subtle piano chords. When I laid down my verse, I felt every word ripple through the room. They say I don't belong, but I wear these scars. Proof I've walked through the fire to reach the stars. This ain't imitation. It's a love so deep. The rhythm's in my soul. The words don't sleep. By October 10th, the sessions were in full swing. Crescent Records had pulled together a lineup of collaborators who weren't just respected, they were legends. From jazz musicians who'd played with the greats to underground MCs who knew the fight I'd faced, each brought a piece of themselves to the album. The studio felt like a sanctuary, a place where ideas flowed freely and egos were left at the door. But outside those walls, the shadows of my past still lingered. Damon's threats had started small, rumors spread through the industry, whispers meant to discredit me, but by October 15th, they had escalated. Anonymous messages flooded my inbox, each one laced with venom. "You're nothing without me," one read. Another, "Watch your back, this isn't over." I tried to block it out, but the fear crept in during the quiet moments, seeping into the edges of my focus. Mama noticed first. She showed up at the studio one evening with food in hand and concern in her eyes. "You can't let him win," she said, her voice calm but firm. "He's trying to shake you. Don't give him the satisfaction." She was right, but it wasn't easy. Every time I stepped into the booth, I felt Damon's shadow hovering just out of reach. But instead of running from it, I leaned into it. I poured the fear, anger, and frustration into my lyrics, turning his threats into fuel. By October 20th, we were working on Chains, a track that dissected the politics of the industry, the gatekeepers, the exploitation, and the way power was used to suppress voices that didn't fit the mold. Collaborating with a powerhouse vocalist named Janae Wilder, we built a song that felt like an anthem, the kind of track that demanded to be heard. Chains ain't just metal, they're words that bind, contracts that trap, dreams left behind. But we break, we rise, we take the mic. Turn their cages to stages, ignite the fight. The tension outside the studio grew, but so did my resolve. On October 30th, as we wrapped up a long day, Marisol pulled me aside. "Ava," she said, her voice steady, "this album isn't just a debut. It's a statement. Whatever Damon throws at you, remember this. You're not just surviving, you're thriving." And she was right. Unbreakable wasn't just about music. It was about standing tall in the face of everything meant to tear me down. It was about owning my voice, my story, and my future. Damon's threats might have loomed, but with every verse, every beat, and every note, I was building something stronger than his anger. Something he could never break. December 12th, 2012. The night began like any typical studio session, filled with beats, lyrics, and the buzz of creative energy that comes with working on something meaningful. We wrapped up around midnight, and I stayed behind to review some vocals. The studio had become my sanctuary, a place where I felt at ease, even in the late hours. When I finally stepped outside, the cold December air hit me sharply through my jacket. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit dimly by a flickering streetlight. I instinctively gripped my bag tighter, the reflex of being a woman alone after dark. But I didn't see them, Damon and the two men, until it was too late. They emerged from the shadows, their footsteps heavy and purposeful. Damon was in the center, his expression twisted with anger and something darker I didn't recognize. "You thought you could just walk away?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "You thought there wouldn't be consequences?" My heart raced, but as the fear rose, so did my anger. I had allowed Damon to intimidate me for too long. This time, I wasn't going to back down. "Stay away from me, Damon," I said, my voice firm despite the rush of adrenaline. "This is not going to end how you think." He laughed, but it wasn't the Damon I once knew. It was cold, calculated. The other two men moved closer, blocking my path to the car. That's when I realized this wasn't a confrontation. It was an ambush. One of the men lunged first, but I was prepared. After months of self-defense classes, I knew how to handle situations like this. My elbow hit his ribcage with force, and he staggered back, gasping for breath. The second man tried to grab my arm, but I twisted out of his grip and pushed him away using my bag as a shield. Damon didn't move immediately. He just stood there, watching, his face showing frustration as I fought back. But then he stepped forward, reaching for me. "Enough," he shouted, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every strike, Every movement was powered by the months of fear and frustration I had built up after breaking free from his control. The noise must have caught attention, because suddenly bright lights flooded the parking lot. Security cameras. I looked up and saw the red light of a camera mounted on the building. A rush of relief hit me. Someone was watching. Someone would know what happened. Damon hesitated, realizing the same thing. He muttered something to his men, and they quickly retreated into the darkness, disappearing as fast as they had arrived. But before Damon left, he turned to me and, with venom in his voice, whispered, "This isn't over." When they were gone, I leaned against my car, shaken but resolute. My mind raced with everything that had just happened, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let this go. By morning, the security footage had been reviewed and shared with authorities. But the story didn't stop there. Within hours, the video leaked online. It captured everything: the ambush, the attack, and my fight back. The response was overwhelming. The community rallied behind me, artists, fans, activists, all showing their support. Hashtags like "Stand with Ava" and "No More Fear" started trending, and the pressure to hold Damon accountable grew stronger by the hour. Damon had tried to silence me, to force me back into submission. But instead, he had sparked something far bigger than he ever anticipated. A movement, a wave of support, and a call for change. December 13th, 2012. I stood before a crowd of reporters, my voice steady, my resolve unwavering. No one should ever be intimidated or controlled for standing up for themselves. This is not just my fight, it's a fight for everyone, and we will not be silenced. Damon had underestimated me. He thought I would break. But that night, I proved that no matter what he tried, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. January 5th, 2013. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the blank page in front of me. The bruises on my arm were fading, but the memories of that night weren't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Damon's face, heard his threats. But I refused to let those moments define me. If there was one thing I knew, it was this: pain could be silenced, but music couldn't. The pen moved before I even realized it, words pouring out in sharp, jagged lines. It wasn't polished or pretty. It was raw, angry, defiant. The first song I wrote was called "Bulletproof," and it didn't hold back. They came for my voice, but I still sing. Tried to chain my soul, but I grew wings. You can bruise my body, but not my mind. Every scar I wear is strength defined. By January 10th, I was back in the studio, channeling everything I felt into my music. Every beat carried the weight of what I'd endured, but it also carried hope. The songs weren't just for me. They were for anyone who'd ever felt powerless, anyone who'd fought to reclaim their story. The media caught on quickly. The footage from that December night was still circulating, sparking debates on power dynamics in the industry and the treatment of young artists. Interviews flooded in, magazines, radio shows, even national TV. They all asked the same questions. How did it come to this? What needs to change? By January 15th, major artists began to speak out. Legends like Queen Latifah and Common took to social media, voicing their support. "What happened to Ava is unacceptable," Latifah posted. "Her courage is inspiring. The industry must do better." Collaborations followed. By January 20th, I was in the studio with Kendrick Lamar, crafting a track that felt like an anthem for change. It was called "Break the Silence." And it wasn't just a song, it was a call to action. Power's not in their hands, it's in the mic. Every word we speak turns dark to light. From the streets to the stage, we take control, rewriting the rules, reclaiming our soul. The hashtag Justice for Ava, which had started in the days following the attack, gained global momentum. Fans shared their stories, turning the movement into something far bigger than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about accountability, justice, and creating a safer space for everyone in the industry. On January 25th, I stood on stage at a benefit concert organized by Crescent Records, surrounded by artists who believed in the same fight. The crowd was electric, their energy fueling every note as I performed Bulletproof live for the first time. You tried to break me, but here I stand, with a voice that echoes across the land. I'm not just surviving, I'm alive. Every battle fought keeps my fire alive. The applause was deafening, but what stayed with me most were the faces in the crowd. Young women, men, and artists who looked at me not as a victim, but as a survivor. January 31st, 2013. As I closed the journal I'd been writing in all month, I realized something. I'd taken the worst thing Damon could throw at me and turned it into something unstoppable. My trauma wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. And this time, I was writing it on my own terms. March 12, 2013. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. Rows of reporters and spectators filled the seats, their eyes shifting between Damon and me like we were actors in a show they couldn't wait to see unfold. But this wasn't entertainment. It was my life. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands gripping the edge of my chair as the bailiff called the court to order. Damon sat across the room, his expression unreadable, but his presence as heavy as ever. The two men who had ambushed me that night flanked him, their faces just as blank. The prosecutor's opening statement was clear and precise, laying out every piece of evidence: the security footage, the threatening messages, the witnesses who'd seen Damon's escalating behavior. But the moment I dreaded most was when they called me to the stand, March 14th. As I swore to tell the truth, the weight of that oath pressed down on me. My palms were damp, but my voice didn't waver. This was my chance to speak, to make them see not just what had happened, but why it mattered. I recounted everything: the ambush, the fear, the way Damon's control had tightened until it snapped into violence. I looked the jury in the eye and told them what it felt like to fight for my life in a parking lot, to stand up to someone who had once been my mentor, but had turned into my greatest threat. But I didn't stop there. This isn't just about me, I said, my voice steady. Damon Reed isn't the only one who's used power to manipulate, intimidate, and control. He's part of a system that allows people like him to thrive. And unless we hold them accountable, it's going to keep happening. The room was silent, the weight of my words settling over everyone. I didn't need to see Damon's reaction. I could feel it, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Over the next few days, others took the stand. Industry veterans, rising artists, and even former associates of Damon testified about the systemic abuse that had gone unchecked for years. Their stories painted a picture that was bigger than Damon, a picture of an industry that had enabled people like him for far too long. March 20th. Closing arguments came and went, and the jury deliberated for hours that felt like days. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, Mama by my side, her hand warm and steady on mine. When the bailiff called us back in, my heart pounded in my chest. Guilty. The word rang out like a release, like the tension I'd been carrying for months had finally snapped. Damon and his accomplices were convicted on multiple charges, including assault and harassment. The sentences would come later, but for now, I had something I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed me, microphones and cameras thrust in my face. I stopped for a moment, just long enough to say what I needed to. This verdict isn't just for me. It's for every artist who's been silenced, every dream that's been crushed under someone else's control. We deserve better. And today, we took a step toward making that happen. March 21st. The headlines blared the news, and the industry buzzed with conversations about change. But for me, the most important moment came later that night, when I sat in my room with my notebook open, pen in hand. I wrote 3 words at the top of the page: on my terms. Damon might have tried to break me, but all he did was teach me how to fight harder. This wasn't just my victory. It was a turning point for an industry that had needed one for far too long. And as I started the next chapter of my life, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer writing my story in fear. I was writing it in power. June 4th, 2013. The moment I saw Unbreakable at the top of the charts, I didn't feel the rush I'd always imagined. It wasn't the adrenaline of success or the thrill of accomplishment. It was something quieter, deeper. It was validation. Not of fame, but of the journey it took to get there. The weeks leading up to the release were a whirlwind of nerves and anticipation. Crescent Records had thrown everything behind the album, but it wasn't just their confidence that mattered. It was mine. Every track on Unbreakable carried a piece of me: the fear, the fight, the hope, and the scars. It wasn't just music. It was survival, captured in 16 songs. The opening track, Ashes to Anthem, set the tone. Critics called it a battle cry, but for me, it was a reckoning. The lyrics didn't shy away from the attack, but they refused to dwell in anger. They struck my name, thought I'd fall in shame, but I rose from the fire, burned their blame. This voice is mine. It's my own refrain, turning ashes to an anthem, breaking chains. I wanted the album to speak for itself, and it did. By June 6th, the reviews started pouring in. Words like raw, honest, and transformative appeared in every headline. Rolling Stone called it a searing exploration of resilience, while Pitchfork praised its ability to turn personal pain into universal empowerment. But the moment that stayed with me wasn't the headlines or the chart placements. It was the messages. Fans from around the world shared how the album had touched them, how songs like Bulletproof and Roots had given them strength they didn't know they had. June 10th, I found myself on stage again, performing at a sold-out show in New York. The crowd wasn't just there to listen, they were there to connect. When I started Chains, their voices joined mine, turning the lyrics into a shared declaration. They locked us down, but we built a key, broke their mold, now we're finally free. From the cracks in the walls, our light will shine. This battle's not just yours, it's also mine. The energy was electric, but it wasn't about me. It was about the collective power of every voice in that room. Unbreakable wasn't just an album, it was a conversation, one that reached beyond the music industry. Activists and advocates latched onto its message, using it as a rallying cry for reform. Panels were held, policies were discussed, and the movement I'd sparked months ago found a new anthem. June 15th, I sat down with a journalist who asked me the question I'd been waiting for. Your album addresses the attack, but it doesn't seem to focus on revenge. Why? I took a deep breath, knowing the answer was as important as the music itself. Because anger doesn't build, it burns. I wanted Unbreakable to be about what comes after, the rebuilding, the reclaiming, and the refusal to let someone else's actions define me. This album isn't about them, it's about us. By the end of June, Unbreakable was more than an album. It was a movement, a reminder that art could do more than entertain. It could heal, inspire, and ignite change. And as I looked forward, one thing was clear. My story wasn't finished. This was just the beginning. September 9th, 2013. The day we launched Voices Unbroken felt like the start of something much bigger than me. The press release had barely gone out, but the phones at Crescent Records were already ringing with inquiries. People wanted to know what this was, what it meant for the industry, for artists, for the future of music. And for the first time, I felt like I had the answer. Voices Unbroken wasn't just a foundation. It was a promise. A promise to the countless artists who had been silenced, manipulated, or exploited. A commitment to make sure what happened to me, and so many others, wouldn't happen again. The idea had come to me during the Unbreakable recording sessions. I kept thinking about the younger version of myself. The girl who walked into the basement, wide-eyed and hopeful, without a clue about the dangers lurking behind the scenes. What if she'd had someone to guide her? Someone to warn her? What if there had been a system in place to protect her voice before anyone tried to take it away? By September 15th, the mentorship program was in full swing. We started small, pairing seasoned artists with up-and-coming talent to guide them through the industry maze. It wasn't just about teaching them how to write a hit song or negotiate a contract. It was about building resilience, giving them the tools to stand tall in a world that often sought to shrink them. One of my first mentees was a 17-year-old singer named Lila, a girl with a voice that could silence a room. She'd been on the verge of signing a deal with a label notorious for its predatory practices. They said they'd make me a star, she told me during one of our first sessions, her voice trembling. But it didn't feel right. Together, we dissected the contract, breaking down the clauses that would have trapped her for years. When she finally signed with a smaller, artist-friendly label, she sent me a message that brought tears to my eyes. You saved me. Thank you for helping me see my worth. But Voices Unbroken wasn't just about mentorship. By September 20th, we'd partnered with several major labels to push for systemic change. Meetings were tense at first, executives wary of what reform might cost them, but I refused to back down. This isn't just a moral issue, I told them during one particularly heated discussion. It's a business issue. Protecting artists protects the future of this industry. The turning point came when one of the biggest labels in the world, Universal Music Group, signed on to implement what we called the Artist Integrity Guidelines. These outlined clear policies on safety, mentorship, and accountability. Rules that would set a new standard for how artists were treated from the moment they entered the industry. By the end of the month, the foundation had gained momentum I hadn't dared to dream of. Donations poured in, artists volunteered their time, and the media praised our efforts as a groundbreaking movement for reform. But the most powerful moment came on September 30th, when we hosted our first public event, a panel discussion featuring some of the most respected names in music. As I stood on stage, looking out at the audience filled with young artists, industry veterans, and fans, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This foundation isn't about erasing the past, I said, my voice steady. It's about building a future where every artist feels safe, valued, and free to create without fear. It's about breaking the cycles that have silenced too many voices for too long. That night, as the crowd rose to their feet in applause, I knew we'd started something unstoppable. Voices Unbroken wasn't just an organization. It was a movement. And it was just getting started. February 9th, 2014. The night the world stopped calling me a newcomer and started calling me a force. My name was written in gold on the program, but it wasn't real until the spotlight hit me, until my name was called. I'd been nominated for Best New Artist, a category stacked with talent so fierce I hadn't dared to imagine winning. Sitting in the audience, surrounded by the biggest names in music, I felt like the same girl who used to scribble rhymes behind the counter of Miss Evelyn's store. But when the envelope opened and the presenter said, "And the Grammy goes to Ava Carter," everything changed. I stood up, my legs trembling but my heart steady. The applause washed over me as I made my way to the stage, my dress sparkling under the lights, my palms sweating around the edges of my acceptance speech. But when I reached the mic, the words I'd rehearsed dissolved into something raw and real. This is for every voice that was told it wasn't enough, for every dream that was crushed before it had a chance to fly, and for every survivor who refused to let their story end in silence. This Grammy isn't just mine, it's ours. Thank you. The room erupted, but the night wasn't over. The stage I was about to step onto wasn't for a speech. It was for something bigger, something that had been building in me for months. The producers had asked me to perform Phoenix Rising, the song that had become a battle cry for a generation of dreamers and fighters. As I stood center stage, the opening chords echoing through the arena, I thought about every step it had taken to get here. The battles, the heartbreaks, the moments when I almost gave up. This wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration. My voice rose with the first line, every note carrying the weight of my journey. They thought they could bury me, but I grew roots they couldn't see. From the ashes I soared so high, now I'm the flame lighting up the sky. The screen behind me lit up with images of survivors, their faces strong and unbroken. Some were artists I'd mentored. Others were fans who had shared their stories with me. As the chorus swelled, the crowd began to rise, their voices joining mine in a moment I'll never forget. When the final note faded, the arena was silent for a heartbeat. Then the applause came. Louder, stronger, more powerful than anything I'd ever heard. My peers were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. It wasn't just a standing ovation, it was an acknowledgement of everything I'd fought for. After the performance, backstage was a whirlwind of congratulations and questions. But when I finally had a quiet moment, sitting in my dressing room with the Grammy in my lap, I let myself breathe. I thought about Mama, who had been watching from the front row, her eyes shining with pride. I thought about the little girl I'd been, scribbling verses and dreaming of a stage like this. And I thought about everyone who had ever felt silenced, knowing this wasn't just a win for me, it was a win for them. February 9th wasn't just Grammy night. It was a night that proved something I'd known all along. When you refuse to stay silent, your voice doesn't just echo, it changes the world. May 5th, 2014. The jet touched down in London at dawn, and as I stared out the window at the city skyline, it hit me. This wasn't just a tour. This was a mission. Unbreakable had taken on a life of its own, its message crossing oceans and languages, turning pain into power for people I'd never even met. The Phoenix Rising World Tour wasn't about selling out arenas or breaking records. It was about spreading that message as far as it could go, making sure no voice was left unheard. The first stop was the O2 Arena, a massive space that felt almost intimidating until I stepped onto the stage. That night, the energy in the crowd was electric, but the highlight wasn't the music. It was the conversations I had afterward. Young women and men waiting by the green room doors, eager to tell me their stories. One girl, maybe 16, handed me a folded letter. "Your song saved me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside, her words poured out. Stories of fear, survival, and hope. She wasn't alone. City after city, the pattern repeated. Survivors came forward, not just for autographs, but to share their truth. Their courage left me humbled, and their stories fueled me to keep going. By May 15th, Voices Unbroken had expanded internationally. What started as a foundation in Atlanta had grown into a global movement. We set up teams in every major tour city, working to create safe spaces for survivors at every venue, rooms where they could gather, share, and find resources. In Berlin, I met a group of artists who had started their own version of Voices Unbroken. They called it Stimmen für Freiheit, Voices for Freedom, and they'd already launched workshops for at-risk youth. "We were inspired by you," their leader said, holding up a worn copy of my album. "Your song showed us what's possible." May 25th. In Cape Town, I visited a community center filled with kids who had been using music to heal from trauma. They performed a song for me, their voices rising in harmony, and I could barely hold back tears. The walls of that center were covered in lyrics, some mine, some theirs, but all of them carrying the same message: resilience. Everywhere I went, I saw the impact of what we built, but I also saw how much more work there was to do. The stories of abuse and exploitation weren't confined to one industry or one country. They were universal. And every story reminded me why I'd started this fight in the first place. By the time the tour reached Tokyo on May 30th, the Phoenix Rising movement had become something bigger than I could have imagined. Fans weren't just singing along. They were organizing, creating change in their communities, and amplifying voices that had been silenced for too long. That night, before my encore, I addressed the crowd. "This stage isn't just mine, it's yours. Every word we sing tonight is a step toward a world where no one has to suffer in silence. Thank you for believing, for fighting, for rising with me." The response was deafening, but it wasn't about the applause. It was about the unity, the shared understanding that we were all part of something greater. May 31st, 2014. As the tour rolled on, I realized the world was listening, not just to the music, but to the message. Phoenix Rising wasn't just a title anymore. It was a global call to action, and together we were answering it. August 15th, 2014. The day Phoenix, the Ava Carter Story premiered, I felt a nervousness I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't like stepping onto a stage or releasing an album. This was letting the world into my life, pulling back the curtain on every scar, every fight, every moment that shaped the person I had become. The premiere was held in Los Angeles, in a theater packed with fans, industry insiders, and my family. As the lights dimmed and the opening scenes began to play, I gripped Mama's hand tightly, her warmth grounding me. On the screen, the camera panned across the streets of Atlanta, past the basement, and finally landed on me, sitting in that now familiar room with my notebook in hand. The documentary wasn't just about the highs. It didn't shy away from the darker moments, the ambush, the trial, the battles I fought to reclaim my voice. It showed the nights I cried alone in my bedroom, the moments I doubted if I was strong enough to keep going. But it also captured the resilience, the writing sessions, the world tour, the lives that had been touched along the way. August 16th. By the second day, the documentary was breaking records. Streaming platforms reported millions of views within the first 24 hours. Social media buzzed with clips, quotes, and reactions, fans tagging me in posts about how much the story had moved them. One of the most talked about scenes was an interview with Mama. Sitting in her modest living room, surrounded by photos of me as a child, she spoke with a quiet strength that brought tears to my eyes. "Ava always had a fire in her," she said, her voice steady. Even when things got hard, she never let anyone put it out. Watching her rise, knowing how much she's been through, it's the proudest feeling a mother could have. Another standout moment came from an interview with Kayla, who shared stories about sneaking me into the basement at 15, laughing as she recounted how nervous I'd been before my first battle. "I always knew she'd make it," she said, her grin contagious. "What I didn't know was how far she'd go." But the most intimate parts were the ones where I spoke directly to the camera, reflecting on the journey in my own words. Sitting in the studio where I'd recorded Unbreakable, I talked about the power of turning pain into purpose, of using art to create change. "This isn't just my story," I said, my voice clear. "It's the story of everyone who's ever fought to be heard, to be seen, to matter. If I've learned anything, it's that our voices are stronger than we realize, and when we use them together, there's nothing we can't overcome." By August 20th, the documentary had sparked conversations around the world. Fans and critics alike praised its honesty, calling it a raw and unflinching look at the cost of resilience. Messages flooded in from survivors, artists, and activists, each one echoing a similar sentiment. "Thank you for showing us we're not alone." But for me, the most powerful moment came on August 25th, when Mama handed me a letter. It was from a 14-year-old girl in Detroit who wrote about how the documentary had inspired her to write her first song. "You made me believe in myself," she wrote. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell your story so I can tell mine." That letter reminded me why I'd done this. Not for awards, not for recognition, but for the impact. The Ava Carter Story wasn't just a documentary. It was a mirror reflecting the strength and resilience that existed in everyone who watched it. August 31st, 2014. As I sat on the balcony of my hotel room, the city lights stretching out before me, I felt a quiet peace. The story had been told, the truth laid bare, and while the journey wasn't over, this chapter felt complete. My story had become a part of something bigger, a flame passed from one hand to the next, lighting the way forward. October 12th, 2014. The moment I walked through the door of the basement, it felt like the walls were breathing with memories. The smell of sweat, smoke, and history clung to the air just as it had the first time I stepped inside as a wide-eyed 15-year-old. But this time, I wasn't sneaking in. I was coming home. The room was packed, a sea of familiar faces mixed with new ones, all buzzing with excitement. People who had been there from the beginning, the ones who had doubted me, cheered for me, even challenged me, were now here to celebrate. The stage, barely more than a platform with a single spotlight, felt just as small as it had all those years ago. But the moment I stepped onto it, it became something larger than life. I gripped the mic, letting the roar of the crowd settle into a hum. "The last time I stood here, I was just a kid with a notebook full of rhymes and a head full of dreams," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion swelling in my chest. "Tonight, I'm here because of all of you. Because this place didn't just teach me how to spit, it taught me how to fight." The beat dropped, heavy and raw, and the crowd erupted as I launched into Roots, one of the defining tracks from Unbreakable. My voice carried through the room, every word a tribute to the journey that had started here. But the highlight of the night wasn't the songs they already knew. It was what came next. Midway through the set, I paused, scanning the crowd. "Tonight isn't just about me," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "It's about everyone who's ever stood on this stage and left their heart on it." And then I brought them out. One by one, I called on the voices that had shaped this space: Spitfire, Vortex, even some of the MCs I'd battled in those early days. The crowd went wild as each one took the stage, spitting verses that reminded everyone why this place was legendary. But the biggest surprise came when I handed the mic to Kayla, my cousin, the one who had snuck me in all those years ago. "This one's for Ava," she said, her voice strong, her grin infectious, "for showing us all what it means to rise." Her freestyle was short but powerful, and when she finished, the room shook with applause. The night ended with something I hadn't done in years, a freestyle, raw and unplanned. The beat was stripped down, just a loop and a drum line, and I let the words pour out. From these walls to the world, I carried this flame, tried to silence my voice, but I rewrote the game. The girl who stood here, scared and small, now stands unbroken, standing tall. This mic is a weapon, this stage is my ground, and every voice here is a victory sound. To the basement, to the roots, to the ones who believed, this is your triumph. Together, we achieved. When I dropped the mic, the crowd surged, their cheers deafening. They weren't just celebrating me, they were celebrating us. This wasn't just my homecoming. It was a reminder that no matter how far I'd gone, my roots were still here, in the place that taught me to rise. October 13th, 2014. As I left the basement in the early hours of the morning, the cool Atlanta air brushing against my skin, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. The journey wasn't over, but this chapter had come full circle. The girl who had walked into the basement all those years ago was now a woman leaving it, carrying not just dreams, but a legacy. January 15th, 2015. Walking into the Capitol felt heavier than any stage I'd ever stepped onto. The weight of history, the eyes of the nation, and the voices of countless artists echoed in my mind as I made my way toward the hearing room. I wasn't here to perform. I was here to fight. The invitation to testify before Congress had come months ago, but the reality of it didn't hit me until I was seated at the long wooden table, facing a row of lawmakers. The cameras were already rolling, their lenses trained on me as if waiting to see if I'd crack. But I didn't. Not today. This isn't just about music, I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through me. It's about the people behind the music, the creators, the dreamers, the storytellers, who deserve to work in an industry that values their humanity as much as their talent. I shared my story, every detail of it. From the first time I stepped onto a stage to the night I fought for my life in that parking lot. I spoke about the power imbalance that had allowed people like Damon to thrive, and the silence that had kept artists afraid to speak out. But I also spoke about the movement that had risen in the aftermath, the survivors who had turned pain into purpose, the fans who had amplified their voices, and the industry insiders who had started to demand better. The Carter Guidelines, I said, holding up the document that had become the backbone of our advocacy, are a roadmap for change. They outline clear protections for artists, mandatory mentorship programs, transparency in contracts, and a zero-tolerance policy for abuse and exploitation. These aren't suggestions, they're necessities. The room was silent as I finished, the weight of my words lingering in the air. One congresswoman leaned forward, her voice breaking the stillness. Ms. Carter, what do you hope this legislation will achieve? I met her gaze, my answer ready. I hope it will save lives. I hope it will protect the next generation of artists from the pain so many of us have endured. And I hope it will remind the industry that its greatest asset isn't money or power, it's people. Over the next week, the hearings continued with testimonies from other artists, industry leaders, and even executives who had seen the need for change firsthand. By January 22nd, the momentum was undeniable. Major labels like Universal and Atlantic publicly announced their support for the Carter Guidelines, pledging to implement the changes across their companies. But the most powerful moment came on January 30th, when Congress introduced the Artist Protection and Accountability Act. The legislation, built on the foundation of the guidelines, aimed to create systemic safeguards for artists across all creative industries. The news spread quickly. Headlines declared it a watershed moment for the music world, and social media buzzed with posts from fans and artists alike. But for me, the true victory wasn't in the headlines, it was in the quiet moments. The emails from young artists thanking me for fighting for them, the conversations with survivors who felt seen for the first time, the knowledge that we were building something lasting. That night, as I stood on my balcony overlooking the lights of Washington, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. This fight hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. But for the first time I could see the change. Not just in the laws or the industry, but in the people. In their hope, their resilience, their belief that things could get better. January 31st, 2015. The world was listening, and this time, we weren't just singing. We were shouting, demanding, building a future where every artist could thrive without fear. And as I prepared for the next step in this journey, I knew one thing for sure. Our voices weren't just being heard. They were making history. March 10th, 2015. The steel gates clanged shut behind me, their echo reverberating through the empty corridors. I'd thought long and hard about coming here, about what I needed to say, and whether it was worth reopening wounds I'd worked so hard to heal. But closure isn't something you wait for. It's something you create. And I was here to take mine. The guards led me down a narrow hallway, the air thick with a silence that pressed on my chest. When we reached the visitation room, I stopped for a moment, staring at the heavy door in front of me. On the other side was the man who had once controlled my life, who had tried to break me in every way he knew how. But I wasn't walking in as the girl he had manipulated. I was walking in as the woman who had reclaimed her power. When I stepped through, Damon was already seated at the table, his hands cuffed, his face older but still familiar. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. I didn't sit right away. I stood, meeting his gaze with a steadiness I wasn't sure I'd ever feel. "You're the last person I expected to see here," he said finally, his voice quieter than I remembered. "I'm not here for you," I replied, my tone firm but calm. "I'm here for me." I sat down, my hands folded in front of me, the weight of the moment settling between us. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence heavier than any words could have been. Then, I took a deep breath and began. "You took a lot from me, Damon," I said, my voice steady. "You tried to take my career, my confidence, my safety. You hurt me in ways I didn't think I'd ever recover from, but you didn't win." He flinched at that, his jaw tightening, but I pressed on. "I'm here because I need you to know something. I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I do. Carrying anger, hatred. That's your burden, not mine. And I won't let you have that power over me anymore." His expression shifted, a mix of disbelief and something I couldn't quite name. For the first time, he looked small, like the walls of his own choices were finally closing in around him. "I didn't think you'd ever forgive me," he murmured. "I'm not your savior, Damon," I said, leaning forward. "Forgiveness isn't friendship. It's not a second chance. It's me letting go of the grip you had on my life. You'll have to live with what you did. That's your sentence. Not mine." The cameras were there, capturing every second of our exchange. This wasn't just a moment for me. It was for every person who had ever faced their abuser, for every survivor who had found the strength to reclaim their story. When I stood to leave, Damon didn't try to stop me. He didn't say another word. And that silence was more powerful than anything he could have said. March 11th, 2015. As I walked out of that prison, the sun was brighter than I remembered, the air lighter. For the first time in years, I felt truly free, not just from Damon, but from the anger and fear that had followed me for so long. That visit wasn't about him. It was about me, about showing myself that I was stronger than the pain, that I had risen above what tried to destroy me. And as I stepped into the light of that day, I knew one thing for certain. The chapter I just closed would never be reopened. This was the end of his story in my life, and the beginning of a future where I wrote every line. June 2nd, 2015. The day Revolution Starts Within dropped, I felt the same nervous excitement that had coursed through me when Unbreakable first hit the world. But this wasn't just another album. This was a manifesto, a challenge to everyone listening, and in many ways, to myself. The title wasn't just a phrase. It was a truth I'd learned the hard way. Change doesn't begin in boardrooms or on stages. It starts deep inside, in the quiet moments when you decide who you're going to be. This album wasn't just music. It was the reflection of that journey. The first track, Echoes of the Fight, opened with a spoken word piece by the one and only Maya Angelou, her voice sampled from an archival recording. Hearing her words layered over a soulful beat sent chills down my spine every time. The song wove my story with hers, a testament to the battles fought and the resilience it takes to keep moving forward. June 10th. The album featured collaborations that I could have only dreamed of years ago. I worked with Kendrick again, his verses on Rebel's Anthem crackling with fire and urgency. Lauryn Hill lent her vocals to Freedom's Lullaby, a track so raw it felt like a wound exposed to the world. And on We Rise, Stevie Wonder himself played the harmonica, his notes threading through my lyrics like a prayer. Streaming platforms were ready for something bold, and I gave it to them. On June 12th, I debuted the entire album live, performing each track in a raw, stripped-down set. The stage was simple, just me, a mic, a guitar, and a spotlight. But the response was anything but small. Millions tuned in, their comments flooding the stream as they connected to the stories behind the music. This isn't just an album, one critic wrote the next day. It's a revolution in sound and spirit. Ava Carter has transcended the label of artist. She's become a movement. But it wasn't just the critics. Messages poured in from fans around the world. One stood out. A young woman from Brazil who shared how revolution starts within had inspired her to leave an abusive relationship. "Your words gave me the strength to find my freedom," she wrote. That message reminded me why I made music in the first place. Not for awards or accolades, but for impact. By June 20th, the album had topped charts globally, but what mattered most to me was the dialogue it sparked. Panels were held, articles written, conversations started, all exploring the themes of the album: personal accountability, societal change, and the undeniable power of community. The final track, Silent No More, became an anthem overnight. Its chorus echoed in rallies, protests, and even classrooms, its words etched into the hearts of those who heard it. From whispers to roars, our voices ignite. No longer in shadows, we step into light. The revolution begins where fear had control, but now we rise with fire in our soul. June 30th. As I stood backstage at a small, intimate venue in Chicago preparing for an acoustic set, I realized how much I'd grown since the days of Unbreakable. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. It was about living my truth, about using my platform to lift others as I climbed. When I stepped onto that stage and played the first chords of Freedom's Lullaby, I wasn't just performing. I was sharing a piece of myself, a reflection of the revolution that had started within me and spread to everyone willing to listen. This wasn't just a second album, it was the beginning of something even greater. A revolution that didn't end with the music, but carried on in every voice it inspired. January 10th, 2020. It's surreal to watch the world change, and know you had even a small part in it. Sitting in my living room that morning, sipping coffee while reading an article about how the music industry had overhauled its artist protection policies, I felt a quiet pride ripple through me. It wasn't about ego, it was about the undeniable proof that the work we'd started had taken root. The reforms weren't just a headline, they were tangible. Labels had adopted the Carter Guidelines as industry standards, ensuring mentorship, transparency, and zero tolerance for exploitation. Contracts were clearer, support systems stronger, and artists, finally, were starting to feel safe in the spaces where they created. Voices Unbroken had grown beyond anything I'd ever imagined. What began as a small initiative in Atlanta was now a global network, with hubs in over 50 countries. In South Africa, our team was mentoring young poets. In Japan, they were empowering underground rappers. In Brazil, they'd launched workshops for women in music production. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about building something better. April 15th, 2020. I walked into Harvard University, invited to speak at a symposium where their business school was presenting a case study on my journey and its impact on the industry. The weight of the moment hit me as I stood at the podium, looking out at a room filled with academics, students, and industry leaders. "This isn't just my story," I began, my voice steady but warm. "It's the story of everyone who believed that change was possible. It's the story of survivors who turned their pain into power, of communities that refused to stay silent, and of an industry that finally began to listen." The case study dissected everything, from Unbreakable to Revolution Starts Within, from the prison visit to the legislation push. They'd analyzed the cultural ripple effects, charted the rise of artist-centered initiatives, and even measured the financial benefits of creating safer work environments. After my talk, a young woman approached me. She was trembling slightly, clutching a notebook filled with annotations. "I'm studying to be a producer," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "Your work made me believe I could do it without sacrificing my voice." Her words stayed with me. For years, I'd heard stories of people finding their strength through my music, but now I was seeing something even more powerful, the seeds of a new generation rising, ready to take the reins and redefine what the industry could be. June 2020. Articles started pouring in about the shift in culture. Major publications ran features on the Ava Carter effect, detailing how the changes I'd fought for were reshaping not just music but entertainment as a whole. They talked about the young artists citing my influence, not just in their sound, but in their business decisions, their advocacy, their refusal to accept the old norms. One interview stood out, a 19-year-old singer from Nigeria who said, "Ava Carter didn't just teach us how to sing. She taught us how to fight. She taught us how to rise." October 10th, 2020. As I sat down to write in my journal that evening, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past decade, I realized something profound. The revolution wasn't about me anymore. It had grown beyond my voice, my story. It was now a chorus, a symphony of voices building something greater than any one person. This wasn't just a culture shift. It was a legacy. And as I penned the last line of that day's entry, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. The revolution starts within, but it doesn't end there. It grows, it evolves, and it lives on in every voice it touches. July 4th, 2022. Standing on the steps of the White House, the sun warming my face, I felt a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The President of the United States had just placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around my neck, its weight a symbol of every step, every fight, every moment that had brought me here. The Rose Garden was filled with leaders, artists, activists, faces I'd admired, voices that had shaped the world. But in that moment, all I could think about were the countless people who weren't here, the voices that had been silenced, the dreams that had been stolen. This honor wasn't just mine, it was theirs. As I stepped up to the podium, my heart beat steady. The medal glinted in the light, but my focus was on the words I'd prepared. Words that needed to resonate far beyond this garden. When I was 15, I began, my voice clear. I snuck into a small underground venue in Atlanta with nothing but a dream and a notebook full of rhymes. I never imagined that journey would lead me here. But today, as I stand on this stage, I carry with me the stories of so many who made this moment possible. I paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle. This medal is not just a recognition of what has been done. It is a reminder of what remains to be done. It's a call to action, a challenge to all of us to continue building a world where every voice is heard, where every artist is safe, and where every dream is given the chance to flourish. The crowd was silent, their attention rapt. I continued, shifting my focus to the future. Today, I'm proud to announce the expansion of the Voices Unbroken Youth Program. Over the next 5 years, we will establish over 100 creative safe spaces in underserved communities, providing mentorship, resources, and opportunities to the next generation of artists and leaders. Applause broke out, rippling through the audience, but I wasn't done. Because the work doesn't stop here. The fight doesn't end with a medal, or a law, or even a cultural shift. The fight continues in every classroom, every studio, every stage where someone dares to create something new and say, "This is me, this is my voice, and I will not be silenced." When I stepped back from the podium, the standing ovation that followed felt like a wave of energy, lifting me, reminding me of the strength in collective belief. Leaders from every walk of life rose to their feet, their applause not just for me, but for the movement we'd built together. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my hotel room, the medal resting on the table beside me, I let the moment wash over me. This wasn't about recognition. It was about responsibility, about carrying the torch forward, lighting the path for those who would come next. July 4th, 2022 wasn't just a day of honor. It was a reminder that freedom isn't just about independence, it's about empowerment. And as I wrote in my journal that night, I made a promise. This medal will never be the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. March 12th, 2024. The first copies of Phoenix Unbound arrived at my doorstep in a plain brown box, but holding that book in my hands felt anything but ordinary. The cover glimmered under the light, my name etched beneath the title that encapsulated everything I'd fought for: freedom, resilience, and the power of rising from the ashes. Writing the memoir had been its own kind of battle, a raw excavation of memories, some triumphant, others painful. But as the release date approached, I knew the world was ready to see not just the headlines, but the unvarnished truth behind them. By March 15th, Phoenix Unbound was on shelves everywhere, from small independent bookstores to towering displays in chain retailers. And within 24 hours, it hit #1 on the bestseller lists. Social media buzzed with photos of readers clutching their copies, tagging me with captions like, "This book is changing my life," and "a masterclass in courage." The chapters didn't just chronicle the highs, they dove deep into the lows. The moments of doubt, the nights I thought of walking away, the relentless fight to reclaim my voice. But they also celebrated the power of community, the people who stood beside me, and the movement that grew from our collective strength. April 2024. Schools across the country began adding Phoenix Unbound to their curriculums. High school English classes dissected my journey as a modern hero's arc, while college courses used it to explore social movements, art, and activism. I received a letter from a teacher in Detroit who said her students had started their own Voices Unbroken chapter after reading the book. "They see themselves in your story," she wrote, "and now they believe they can rise too." By May, the memoir had inspired something I hadn't expected: a new movement. Readers from all walks of life came together, using the book as a blueprint to spark change in their own communities. They called it the Phoenix Project, and it wasn't just about the music industry. It was about dismantling power imbalances wherever they existed. June 1st, 2024. I woke up to an email that felt like a dream. A major studio had acquired the film rights to Phoenix Unbound. They wanted to turn my story into a feature-length film, something that could bring the message to an even wider audience. The buzz was instantaneous. Directors, actors, and producers all vying for a chance to be part of the project. But for me, the most important thing was ensuring the story stayed authentic, that it honored not just my voice, but the voices of everyone who had walked this path with me. June 15th. I stood on stage at a packed book signing event in New York, looking out at a crowd of readers, fans, and dreamers. As I opened the floor to questions, a young girl raised her hand. "What's the most important thing you learned writing this book?" she asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. I smiled, thinking about the long nights, the tears, and the triumphs that had brought me here. "I learned that our stories are our power," I said. "When we share them, when we own them, we inspire others to do the same. This book isn't just my story, it's yours too, and together, we're unbound." As the applause filled the room, I felt the weight of the journey behind me and the promise of the road ahead. Phoenix Unbound wasn't just a memoir, it was a movement, a legacy, and a reminder that no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. July 20th, 2024. The grand opening of the Voices Unbroken Center for Creativity and Advocacy felt like standing on the summit of a mountain I'd spent years climbing. The center was everything I'd dreamed of. Vibrant walls filled with art, recording studios echoing with possibility, and classrooms ready to nurture the next generation of artists. It wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was packed with familiar faces, activists, artists, and survivors who had walked this journey with me. Mama stood beside me, holding the oversized scissors with a grin that said she'd never been prouder. As the ribbon fell, applause filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and cheers from the crowd. "This center," I said, stepping up to the mic, "is more than brick and mortar. It's a promise that no artist will ever have to feel alone, silenced, or afraid. Here, we create without limits, we rise without fear, and we leave a legacy of resilience and power." August 2024. The music industry declared a week-long celebration in honor of the impact Voices Unbroken had made over the past decade. Concerts, panels, and events unfolded across cities worldwide, with artists sharing how the movement had transformed not just their careers, but their lives. The highlight of the week was a televised gala in Atlanta, where leaders of the industry came together to honor the work that had sparked a cultural revolution. It was a night filled with gratitude and reflection. But the most unforgettable moment came when the stage lights dimmed, and I stepped forward with a group of survivors. The Voices Unbroken Choir, as they called themselves, had spent months preparing for this performance. Each member had their own story, some from the music world, others from entirely different walks of life, but they all shared a common thread: resilience. Together, we performed Silent No More, the anthem that had become a rallying cry for the movement. The harmonies were electric, their voices blending with mine as we sang. From whispers to roars, our voices ignite. No longer in shadows, we step into light. The revolution begins where fear had control, but now we rise with fire in our soul. The audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous, their tears reflecting the power of the moment. It wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration that our stories, our voices, and our legacy would never be silenced. October 2024. I returned to the basement, the place where it all began. The venue looked the same. Dim lighting, graffiti-covered walls, and that unmistakable energy humming through the air. But this time, I wasn't there as a hopeful kid with a borrowed ID. I was there to bring everything full circle. The crowd was a mix of old faces and new, people who'd been there for my first battles, alongside young artists just starting their journeys. When I stepped onto the stage, the cheers were deafening, but I raised my hand, signaling for quiet. This room, I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion, taught me how to fight. It taught me how to rise. And tonight, I want to celebrate not just where I've been, but where we're all going. I performed a set that spanned my career, each song carrying a piece of the journey that had brought me back to this stage. But the final number wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone in that room. I invited the crowd to join me in a freestyle, their voices rising together in a cacophony of hope, laughter, and unrestrained creativity. As I stepped off the stage, the weight of everything hit me. The journey, the fight, the victories, they'd all led to this moment. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was woven into the lives of everyone I'd met, everyone I'd inspired, and everyone who had inspired me in return. October 30th, 2024. That night, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, the echo of the day still ringing in my ears. The center was open, the industry was changing, and the legacy we'd built was stronger than ever. I wrote one final line in my journal before closing it for the evening. The revolution doesn't end with me. It lives in every voice that dares to rise. December 15th, 2024. The basement was alive with the same magic it had always carried. The buzz of anticipation, the low murmur of a crowd waiting for something unforgettable. I sat in the back, my hood pulled up, watching as a young artist stepped onto the stage. She couldn't have been more than 16, her hands trembling as she gripped the mic, but her eyes burned with a determination I knew all too well. The lights dimmed, and the room fell silent. She took a breath, steadying herself, then launched into her verse. Her words were sharp, her cadence relentless, and with every line, I saw a reflection of myself all those years ago. A girl with something to prove, a story to tell, and a voice she refused to let be ignored. The crowd erupted, their cheers filling the tiny venue as she finished her set. I could see it on her face, the rush of realizing she'd done it, that she'd claimed her space and made it hers. As she stepped off the stage, her friends surrounded her, their phones lighting up to capture the moment. It was a scene I'd witnessed countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. Tonight, I wasn't just watching the next generation. I was seeing the culture we'd built together come to life. The same stage where I'd fought to be heard was now a launchpad for voices that might one day change the world. The lights in the room dimmed further, and soon the space was illuminated by a sea of phone screens, their soft glow creating a moment of quiet unity. I smiled, leaning back in my seat, letting the warmth of it all wash over me. It wasn't about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. This was their stage now, their revolution. I left before the night was over, slipping out the back door as the next performer took the stage. The cold December air hit me, crisp and invigorating, but it wasn't the chill that made me shiver. It was the feeling of knowing, deep in my soul, that everything we'd worked for was still growing, still evolving, still thriving. As I walked down the familiar streets of Atlanta, I looked back at the glow of the basement's neon sign and whispered to myself, the story never ends. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need to write the next chapter. The world was already doing it.